The restaurant buzzed with the usual Friday night energy, clinking glasses, bursts of laughter, the gentle hum of a dozen conversations blending into comfortable chaos. But at table 7, in the corner booth where the light hit just right, something cruel was unfolding that would change everything. Maya Chen sat perfectly still in her wheelchair, her hands folded in her lap, her expression carefully neutral as she watched her college roommates exchange glances across the table. She'd seen those looks before, the barely suppressed giggles, the knowing smirks. When they'd invited her to dinner and casually mentioned they had someone they wanted her to meet, something in their voices had felt off. Now she knew why. The setup had become obvious the moment she'd arrived. This wasn't a friendly dinner. This was entertainment for them, a cruel joke disguised as matchmaking. They'd arranged a blind date, not out of genuine care, but to watch her squirm. To see what would happen when their charity case tried to navigate romance. Maya had spent 3 years since her accident learning to read pity in people's eyes, but this was different. This was malice wearing a smile. "He should be here any minute," Stephanie said, checking her phone with that same twisted grin. "We told him you were. Well, we might have left out a few details." Maya's stomach tightened. Of course they had. They wanted the shock value, the awkward moment when this mystery man arrived and realized he'd been set up with someone in a wheelchair. They wanted to watch him stumble through excuses, watch her face as he inevitably made his exit. It was psychological cruelty dressed up as a girls' night out. "You know what?" Maya reached for her purse, her voice steady despite the rage building in her chest. "I think I'm going to." "Excuse me, are you Maya?" The voice came from beside the table, deep, warm, and utterly sincere. Maya looked up into the eyes of a man who seemed completely out of place in this moment of manufactured humiliation. He was tall, probably in his late 30s, with dark hair touched with gray at the temples and eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. He wore a casual blazer over a simple shirt, nothing flashy, but there was something about his presence that commanded attention. "I'm James Harrison," he said, and then he did something that made Maya's breath catch. Without hesitation, without that telltale flicker of surprise or discomfort, he pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, his movements natural and easy. "I hope I'm not too late." Traffic on the 405 was absolutely brutal. Maya blinked, momentarily thrown. Her roommates had gone silent, their entertainment derailed by this man's complete lack of reaction to her wheelchair. It sat there between them all, the thing they'd expected to be the punchline, and James hadn't even acknowledged it as unusual. "No, you're right on time," Maya managed, studying his face for the crack in the facade, the moment when the act would drop. But his smile remained genuine, his attention focused entirely on her, not her chair. "Good, because I have to confess something." James leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "I almost canceled. Blind dates terrify me, but my daughter, she's 7, told me this morning that I needed to stop being scared of everything, and just go meet people, Dad." He laughed, a self-deprecating sound that reached his eyes. Getting life advice from a second grader is humbling. Despite herself, despite the tension still coiled in her shoulders and the watchful eyes of her so-called friends, Maya felt a smile tugging at her lips. Sounds like she's wise beyond her years. Terrifyingly so. James glanced at the menu, then back at her. "Have you eaten here before? I'm completely lost. I usually exist on whatever's in my daughter's lunchbox that she doesn't finish." The conversation should have been awkward. By all rights, this should have been the disaster her roommates had orchestrated. But somehow, impossibly, James made it feel normal. He asked about her work. She was a graphic designer, freelancing from home, and listened with genuine interest as she described her latest project. He told her about his daughter, Lily, who was obsessed with butterflies and had recently declared she wanted to be a butterfly scientist when she grew up. "I had to explain that the word is lepidopterist," James said, shaking his head with affectionate exasperation. "She tried to say it 17 times and finally told me the word was too fancy for regular people." Maya laughed, really laughed, and it felt like releasing something that had been locked away for months. Across the table, she could see her roommates, confusion morphing into something uglier, disappointment that their show wasn't going as planned. The meal continued, and James never once asked about her wheelchair. Not in the careful, tiptoeing way people usually did, and not in the invasive, boundary-crossing way either. He treated her simply as Maya, a woman he was getting to know over pasta and wine. When the waiter struggled to maneuver around her chair, James smoothly moved his own seat to create more space without making a production of it. When Stephanie tried to interject with a barely veiled dig about Maya's limitations, James politely but firmly redirected the conversation back to a story Maya had been telling about a difficult client. It was only when dinner was winding down that the facade finally cracked, but not in the way anyone expected. "I need to be honest with you," James said, his expression growing serious. He set down his coffee cup and met Maya's eyes directly. "Your friends didn't tell me much about you when they set this up. Actually, they seemed more interested in seeing how I'd react to you than in whether we'd actually connect." Maya's heart sank. Here it was, the moment she'd been waiting for. The kindness had been an act after all, a more sophisticated version of pity. But James wasn't finished. "I recognized that the second I walked up to this table. I've seen that look before, people who think someone else's struggles are entertainment." His voice carried an edge now, and when he glanced at Stephanie and the others, his gaze was cold. "What I can't figure out is why you'd want to be around people who would do that to you." The air seemed to leave the room. Maya stared at him, stunned into silence. "My daughter has been in a wheelchair since she was 4, James continued, his voice softening as he looked back at Maya. "Cerebral palsy. And I've spent 3 years watching people underestimate her, pity her, use her as inspiration porn or as the butt of their jokes. So when I came here tonight and saw what was really happening, I had a choice. I could leave and let them have their fun, or I could stay and get to know the interesting woman they were too shallow to appreciate." Maya felt tears prickling at her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "Not here, not in front of these people who'd wanted to watch her break." "For what it's worth," James said, his voice dropping to something meant only for her, "this has been the best conversation I've had in months. You're funny, talented, and you didn't once judge me for being a single dad who can't remember the last time he went on a date. If you're willing, I'd really like to see you again. Somewhere far away from." He gestured vaguely at the table, "this." Maya felt something shift in her chest, like a door opening onto a view she'd forgotten existed. She thought of all the walls she'd built since her accident, all the times she'd convinced herself that this, exactly this kind of connection, wasn't meant for people like her anymore. She thought of her roommates, who she'd tolerated out of habit and history, who'd never really seen her at all. Then she looked at James, really looked at him, and saw someone who understood. Not because he pitied her, but because he lived in a world where people constantly underestimated someone he loved. He'd chosen kindness not out of obligation, but out of recognition. "Yes," she said simply. "I'd like that very much." James's smile could have lit up the entire restaurant. He pulled out his phone, and they exchanged numbers while her former friend sat in uncomfortable silence. When the check came, James paid for both of them before anyone could protest, then stood and offered Maya his hand. Not to help her, just as a gesture of connection, palm open and waiting. She took it, and felt the warmth of genuine human contact, offered without agenda or expectation. As they left the restaurant together, James walking beside her wheelchair, telling her about Lily's butterfly garden project, Maya realized something profound. The cruelty of others had inadvertently led her to this moment, to this man who saw her humanity first and everything else second. Sometimes the universe worked in mysterious ways, turning intended harm into unexpected grace. Behind them, at table 7, 3 women sat with their phones and their shame, learning too late that cruelty always costs more than the person who delivers it ever expects to pay.